Before this video begins, I would like to give a quick thank you to my Asban Team level patrons Fallon Cortez and Nathan Gibson. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. The Daleks are one of the most famous parts of Doctor Who. They essentially made the show a success back in the 60s and have become a defining feature ever since. One of the few things even non-fans know about Doctor Who. These intimidating genocidal aliens are one of the pillars of the franchise, appearing in almost every series of the modern show without fail. And if you spend enough time in the absolute hellhole that is the Doctor Who fanbase, you might start to notice recurring whispers, rumours of contracts ensuring this unrelenting recurrence of the Daleks. If these rumours are to be believed, then there's a conspiracy of sorts. Red tape and legal stipulations taking creative decisions out of the hands of the writers themselves and forcing them into corners they have since taken the heat for. Today I wanted to finally explore one of Doctor Who's most persistent rumours. So buckle up, because it's time to delve into the dark depths of the Dalek conspiracy.
It's us again! It's us again!
Okay, so it's time for a bit of historical background. The way Doctor Who was produced in its early years was very different to how it is now. Due to the contracts at the time, outside of recurring things like the Doctor and the TARDIS, the script writers retained the rights for the characters and monsters, not the BBC themselves. For example, Brian Hales created the Ice Warriors, so he had the full rights to the monsters and subsequently became the only writer using them in Classic Who. Mervyn Haseman created the character of Brigadier Lethbridge Stewart, so to use that character you have to negotiate with his estate, not the BBC. This has led to things like the BBV fan productions and all sorts of non-BBC spin-off material because they can entirely bypass the BBC themselves and get the license from the individual writers or their estates. I've gone in depth about this subject before and how it relates to the Rani, but it's very topical here because the Daleks, despite their prominence, are one of these very monsters that belong in this weird grey area of rights. Terry Nation, creator of the Daleks, owned the rights of them until his death, with his estate taking control of them after that point. Just to emphasise how wild this rights situation is, the BBC almost lost the ability to use the Daleks outright as early as the 60s, when Nation tried to make a Dalek series of his own in America, so it's something really important to remember throughout this video. Okay, so we've established that the Dalek rights were a little bit messy even during Classic Who. Even in the so-called wilderness years between the televised runs of the show, the rights continued to prove difficult to work with, since they had to be negotiated separately from anything else. Terry Nation was fairly chill about allowing the Daleks to appear in Doctor Who media, but his agent was apparently very ruthless, and his estate has proven to be equally stringent when it comes to the rights of the Daleks. This proved to be a huge problem during the development of Doctor Who Series 1. As the story famously goes, Russell T Davies wanted the Daleks to make their triumphant return in that series, only for that ruthless agent Tim Hancock to block it after pre-production had already begun. Negotiations had been ongoing for months, but Hancock wanted a significantly higher amount of creative control over the Dalek design than the BBC would be willing to allow him. And there was another big sticking point. Looney Tunes. No, I didn't misspeak, bear with me here. In 2003, Warner Bros. Released this, Looney Tunes Back in Action. This globetrotting movie starring Brendan Fraser, Timothy Dalton and Goldberg is an infamous box office bomb, although I loved it as a kid. However, during the sequence in the so-called Area 52, a bunch of aliens break loose and hold on, what's that? Why, if it isn't one of those evil Pepperpots? Maybe Tim Hancock isn't so bad after all. Sorry, what's that? Wait, what do you mean you had no idea about any of this? Yes, surprisingly enough, Looney Tunes Back in Action's illegal alien scene quite literally featured an illegal alien, since the BBC had cleared the use of the Daleks without actually consulting Hancock and the Nation estate, who were the actual rights holders. And this apparently wasn't the first time the BBC had gone behind Hancock's back like this, leading to the withdrawal of the Daleks from Series 1. However, whilst the Doctor Who production team scrambled to cobble together the replacement villains of the Daleks, executive producer Julie Gardner apparently kept communicating with Hancock, and just over a month after he had refused the use of the Daleks, he suddenly reached an agreement with the production team, and history continued with barely a feather ruffled. But after such strict demands and stubbornness, it does beg the question of why Hancock changed his mind so suddenly and quietly. After all, he didn't get the significant creative control he wanted, so what had the BBC offered him in return for the rights? And thus, the conspiracy begins. The first Russell T Davies era of Doctor Who is almost infamous for how often it used the Daleks. Within 4 series, the aliens appeared as the main villains in a whopping 9 episodes, with a story in every single series. It almost became a bit of a joke within the fanbase that Davies would always use the Daleks anytime there needed to be high stakes, with many people criticising the writer for overusing the villains. But alongside these jokes, people began to speculate, especially when Davies' successor Stephen Moffat also heavily used the Daleks. The most common version of this conspiracy is that, as part of the contractual negotiations for Series 1, the BBC agreed to have the Daleks appear in either every series of Doctor Who or every calendar year. Even to this day, you'll get people posting online wondering why the Daleks have to appear so often, and, like clockwork, multiple people will reply confidently asserting this rumour as fact, declaring that the BBC is obligated to put the Daleks in the show on this regular basis, or else they'll lose the rights or something. People never actually seem to suggest any consequences for this rule not being followed, although one rule you should follow is hitting those like and subscribe buttons. Gotcha. So now that we've talked about the details of this rumour, let's look at the evidence in favour. To go back to those contract negotiations, it does make some sense that the BBC would have to make big concessions to manage to secure the deal. After all, Hancock had all the leverage, as shown by the production team changing their plans after being told they couldn't use the Daleks, because they couldn't legally do so. I mean, the Daleks are the definitive Doctor Who villains, they're incredibly memorable and iconic. I can see the BBC being willing to do whatever it takes to secure them for the show, and indeed, there is somewhat of a pattern. The Daleks have certainly appeared in every series between Series 1 and Series 10. Whether that be full-blown episodes or just cameos like in The Wedding of River Song. And even the once yearly speculation does still hold some weight. For example, you may say no Daleks appeared in 2009, but sure enough in Waters of Mars, there it is. It's the same for 2016, where no full series aired, but the Daleks appeared in a promotional short introducing Bill Potts. Between episodes, specials and minisodes, almost every year from 2005 to 2023 features a Dalek appearance. Except one. As far as I'm aware, 2018 featured no Daleks. There was no episode in Series 11, no special in that calendar year, not even a cheeky minisode. Now 2018 is contentious because some people say that the Daleks still appeared in the trailer for 2019's resolution. That brings me to a big part of why I don't believe this rumour. If this is a contractual term, some stipulation that the BBC has to abide by, why on earth would one voiceover line in a 30-second trailer count as honouring those terms? It's possible that the terms follow a rather traditional if you don't use them you lose them rule, similar to how every few years there'll be a Fantastic Four movie made purely to retain the rights and prevent them from returning to the source. But it just doesn't make much sense to me that after being so stubborn before, the Terry Nation estate would suddenly be so lenient to allow such a short technicality to slide, seemingly without even challenging it. And besides, what would even be the benefit for the Nation estate or Tim Hancock or even the BBC? If there's significant money involved, the BBC would surely want to maximise the amount of Dalek use they can get, so such brief cameos wouldn't benefit either side of the contract. One of the most damning blows against the Dalek conspiracy came in 2014, where Stephen Moffat outright implied that there is no contract forcing the showrunners to wheel out the Daleks. Of course, you could say he's just covering for it because no one in their right mind would just outright admit it, but I think Moffat is actually being very honest in this interview, because the most likely explanation for the constant Dalek appearances is that the monsters are simply just so iconic you can't leave them out of Doctor Who. It's always been said that you can't have Doctor Who without the Daleks. They lend a great legitimacy to the show, as proven by Series 1. Let's take a second to consider the philosophical principle of Occam's razor. In simple terms, Occam's razor essentially means when faced with two options explaining the same phenomenon, you should choose the simpler one. In this case, the Daleks have been appearing constantly in the modern show, and the two explanations for that are either a complicated, nebulous contractual obligation, or the fact that they're just an iconic needle mover for the show. The latter is just so much more likely and makes way more sense. There is literally no proof that it's some kind of legal requirement for the Daleks to keep appearing so regularly. It's all just pure conjecture and fan speculation. Admittedly, there is also no definitive proof that there isn't a contract, but like I mentioned, the most likely explanation is simply because everyone wants to see the Daleks and they do so much for the public image of the show. I think it's safe to say that the Dalek conspiracy just doesn't make any sense. There's too much that doesn't add up and so much working against it. But that unfortunately hasn't stopped it persisting to this day. This is frustratingly one of those rumours that will probably never go away, at least until the production team finally rests the Daleks for a full series or a full year with absolutely no technicalities. The popularity of the Daleks is actually working against the production team at the moment because people perceive things like Destination Skaro as further proof of this whole theory. It's almost like a cycle. The Daleks are so popular they're shown yearly, which keeps them popular, therefore making them still show up yearly. And another reason the rumour persists is because we can't see the contract even if it does exist. Whatever negotiations happened in 2005 are obviously locked behind privacy laws, firewalls, and all the security you can expect of a big media franchise. There's literally no way for us to see the licensing agreement to prove it one way or the other. So as long as there's even a shred of doubt, even 1% of uncertainty, people will always believe the theory and refuse to hear otherwise. It's essentially the same ontological stalemate of things like gods and aliens or the afterlife and simulation theory. You can't definitively prove any of these things actually exist, but you also can't prove that they don't. It's very difficult to speculate on contracts and legal documents we will never see, so there will never be a definitive answer to whether the Daleks have a contractual stipulation ensuring their regular appearances, or if it's simply because they're so iconic that they naturally call for such overexposure. However, this kind of recurrence should absolutely be managed more carefully, and the stagnation it has led to is something I'll be covering in a big video fairly soon. Whether the Daleks are obligated to return or not, they're being used way too often, and it's creating some serious issues for their threat level and nature as a terrifying Doctor Who villain. I personally don't think the contract conspiracy is true, and I hate seeing it always come up online with people accepting it as fact. Although part of me would actually love it if it was, because then you could say that Looney Tunes back in action is the reason for one of modern Doctor Who's biggest writing problems. What a wonderful world we would live in. Anyway, do you believe in the Dalek conspiracy, or is it just a bunch of smoke without any fire? Let me know in the comments, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye. And I'd just like to quickly thank my Bantam level patrons, Fallon Cortez and Nathan Gibson, my Diamond level patron, Glenna Clark, my Platinum level patrons, Matthew Burns and Maximilian Foreman, and all my Gold level patrons, Daniel Shillito, Franz Orne aka Alarm Vortex, Leigh Marie Farrell, and Tom Azar. Thank you so much for your support.